Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And the cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" And he said to them, "Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him." My sermon title today is The Transfiguration of Jesus, passage we just read. Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13. I will touch on this in 3 points: God's glory on the mountain, God's glory dimmed, and living in the valley of the dim. God's glory on the mountain. Last week in the combined service, I preached on Mark. And if you remember, Mark 8:31 was the key verse I focused on. And this is the verse where Jesus predicted that he would suffer many things and be rejected, killed, and then resurrected. And this week we follow on 6 days after that event. 6 days later, we are told by Mark, we have the transfiguration on the mountain. There are many speculations about where this mountain is. Some say Mount Tabor, some say Mount Hermon. Mount Tabor is too low. Mount Hermon is about the right height, 9,000 feet above the sea. And then this passage ends with another prediction that Jesus would suffer many things and be treated with contempt, verse 12, and then die and be resurrected, verse 9. So the glory of God is bracketed by 2 very dismal, dismaying predictions. So it's kind of like a sandwich. The meat is good, but the bread doesn't taste good. Mark tells us that Jesus took his 3 leading disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a high mountain, verse 2. Alone with them on this mountain, Jesus was transformed. That's a more modern English word, from the word transfigured. Transfigured translates the Greek word metamorpho, which in English we get the word metamorphosis. Caterpillars metamorphose into butterflies, and they're so beautiful when they finally metamorphosize. So Jesus was transfigured, and his clothes, we are told, became radiant. The Greek word stilbo describes a reflection or perhaps a source of light which is so bright it's like the sun shining back on us from a gold plate, and so it is very, very brilliant. And the clothes that Jesus had became intensely white, whiter than anything on earth, whiter than any launderer on earth could make it. Verse 3. And the cherry on top of the pie, verse 4, Elijah appeared with Moses. And the Jews believed that Elijah never died. God just took him and there he was gone. And some Jews believe Moses too didn't die. We read in the Old Testament that God buried Moses, but there is also this belief that Moses perhaps never died. God just took him back. So you have these two prophets of Israel, very, very great prophets, Elijah and Moses. Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, we will find out later on, is the prophet that was predicted in the Old Testament to return to be the precursor, the prophet before the Messiah comes. And to top it all, the cherry on top of the cherry, if there's such a thing. I don't know, Rita, you bake, maybe you don't have cherry on top of the cherry, right? Maybe a cherry on top of the cream. Well, a cloud overshadowed them. And God spoke, verse 7. Whoa, I want to be there, won't you? Every Jew knew from the Old Testament that no sinful human being can see God's face and live. And both Elijah and Moses too, that's another commonality between them. They both asked to see God. And God says, you can't see me, but I will pass by and you will see my back. This was terrifying stuff, to have God speak and to hear him like a thunder. Wouldn't you be frightened like the three disciples if you saw all these things? But it was exciting stuff also, because after this they could boast about it for many years, right? We saw a glimpse of the glory of God in a cloud, and we saw Jesus in glorious heavenly white, and hearing God speak. And some commentators remark that white is the color of the angels, and whenever you see people from heaven, it's all in white, they're pure. And also white is the traditional dress that is credited to those who are resurrected, because you're pure too. So that's this whiteness, this brilliant whiteness. And of course, if you know the Old Testament well, you know that this account has every resemblance to the Exodus account. So it's like Jesus is another Moses. And therefore, you don't blame the three disciples for Peter equating Jesus with Elijah and Moses. But of course, at this moment, Peter is not right. Jesus is more than Moses and Elijah. But in any case, Moses too climbed a mountain, Mount Sinai. And on top of that mountain, he spoke to God, and there was smoke and thunder, and cloud covered the mountain. And later on, God, we are told, would cover the tabernacle. And Moses goes in and comes out with his face shining with the reflected glory of God. And some of you will know the Hebrew word, the Shekinah glory of God. So they have this great privilege of seeing the Shekinah glory of God. Now, two great prophets appeared, as we just mentioned, Moses and Elijah, but these two have been gone for thousands of years by this time. So this is a momentous event. Jesus, in the eyes of the disciples, was being shown the same favor by God. They were able to see God and hear God. And for the three disciples, it was such a privilege and honor to be there on the front seats looking at this event. And they didn't have to pay for the tickets. Now, terrified as he was, we are told that Peter was terrified, but actually all three of them were terrified. But Peter was the only one. He's the spokesman always. He's the leader of the gang. So he says, I got to say something. And I'm reminded myself that very often when I'm frightened and, the silence, I am always so compelled to say something in the silence, to break the silence, to break the ice. And Peter was like that. He was trying to say something to break the ice, to break the fear of his fellow disciples. And so he says to Jesus, Rabbi, which means my master, and which is a word used for honored teachers. The Jews use it for honored teachers even today. So, Rabbi, my master, Lord, let us build 3 tents. One for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses. You're all equal honored guests. And why would Peter want to do that? Because he says, we want to stay up here for a longer time. This is such a glorious time. I want to be up here forever if I can. Verse 5, Peter had this one desire because this moment was too good to be true and too good a moment to be over in a flash. Unfortunately, in verse 8, we're told indeed it was over in a flash. And they had to go back down to the mountain, to the valley below, verse 9. And that's the experience of many of us in our Christian walks. If you're a young Christian, maybe you've not experienced this. But we have this roller coaster in life with ups and downs in life. And sometimes we are so high, and sometimes we are so low. And God's glory is dimmed. The memory of the transfiguration of whatever great events that God has done in our lives, the miracle that he has done is great, but the memory dims. So down in the valley, God's glory was dimmed as they were overtaken by events. Next week, we'll see that there was this epileptic boy who was ill, and the disciples were struggling to heal him. Down in the valley, there are sick people who need healing. Now, on the way down in verse 9, we are told Jesus cautioned them not to tell anyone about what they had seen. Yeah, it's a glorious event, but you keep quiet about it, at least until Jesus would be resurrected from the dead. Now, this instruction was a great dampener in so many ways and a difficult puzzle at the same time. You see, it's a dampener because the disciples could not boast about this marvelous thing they had seen. You've seen the wonderful miracle of God. And Jesus says, shush, don't tell anyone about it. It's a dampener, isn't it? But worse than that dampener is this shocking news that Jesus, the Messiah, would die. Now, why is that shocking? We all die, don't we? Won't we? Well, first, the Jews at this time believed that all believers would be resurrected. Of course, it's not a surprise to them that Jesus says the Son of Man will rise from the dead. But they believe that it will be a general resurrection of all believers on the last day, Judgment Day. All. But here was Jesus talking about the resurrection of one person, himself, and not on the last day, but 1 week later. Secondly, how could the Messiah suffer and die? The Messiah is going to be King of Kings according to the Old Testament, and he would conquer all the oppressors of Israel, and he would rule the whole world forever. So he was supposed to be victorious over God's enemies and deliver the Jews from oppression. And at the particular moment, it's Roman oppression. So this doesn't sync, as we would say today, right? This expectation of the Messiah and what the Old Testament says he would do, and this Messiah is going to die. It's way a mismatch of concepts and expectations. And thirdly, this Messiah was supposed to come after Elijah. And Elijah would come first, not just to announce the coming of the Messiah, but to restore all things when he came. And Elijah had certain duties, and this comes from a reading of Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 4, verses 5 to 6. And verse 12, Jesus acknowledges that, yes, your teachers are right. Elijah must come and restore all things before the Messiah comes. But as the three disciples looked around, they didn't see anything restored. They didn't see anything made right. Rome was still the colonial power. And things were really messy in Israel. So how is it? Elijah, we just saw Elijah, so Elijah has come. Do you mean, Jesus, there will be another Elijah? Or are you Elijah instead? Maybe you're not Messiah, you're Elijah. And so there's this puzzling in their head. If Elijah has come, when would all the things happen that Malachi had prophesied? The restoration of Israel, the fathers whose hearts, the children whose hearts turn back to their fathers, and so on. So in verse 10, we are told they asked, how could the Messiah die before all these things happen? So they were asking themselves and asking with great puzzlement, so many complications and questions and doubts, so many things they didn't understand. Now in chapter 8, verse 32, last week we saw that Peter had rebuked Jesus for talking like that. When Jesus says the Messiah must suffer and die, Peter decided it was his responsibility as the head of the gang to pull Jesus aside and give him a scolding. And of course, he in turn was scolded by the Lord Jesus for having the mind of man and not the mind of God. You want human things to happen. They are not the things that God wants happen. God's mind is different from your mind. And worse, Peter's remarks were, according to Jesus, satanic, because Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." So Peter spoke too fast and too furiously, too foolishly, twice. Fast and furious, yeah? Don't be fast and furious. The first time, Jesus called him Satan for doing so, for being quick on the draw. Don't be too quick on the draw sometimes, especially when you're saying things that are not from God. So the first time he got scolded for his speaking too fast, and now he hears the God of the universe say, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." So Peter is so excited, he says, "Jesus, let's build 3 tents." And he hears God's answer, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." God appears to be silencing Peter's impulsive words about building tents on the mountain. God seems to be saying to him, shush, shut up, talk less, listen more. And I'm reminded that in my early days as a Christian, I was taught by wiser people that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen more and talk less. And the Chinese, the Chinese word, which is also in Korean, hanja, the Chinese word for an official is written with 2 mouths. An official has 2 mouths. You got to feed him a lot of money. And he talks a lot. So shut up, talk less, and listen more, and listen to Jesus. And here listening would also mean obey him. And here is God also saying, you think Jesus is on par with Elijah and Moses. Yes, Moses was a great giver of the law. But Jesus is the source of the law. It's the author of the law. So here is a very embarrassing situation. Peter speaks publicly and is scolded publicly once again. See, God's mind is so different from human minds. Before the glory can come, and it will indeed come, verse 1 tells us that, there must be the suffering of the Messiah. There must be rejection, humiliation, and death. And then the resurrection 3 days later. So we have to go through all that. We may not want it. Even the Messiah himself, Jesus says, Lord, if it be your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, your will be done. Because if the Messiah did not die and be resurrected, then we would still be in our sins. We would still have to die physically and spiritually. 1 Corinthians 15:17, Paul tells us that. So the Messiah must die. And Jesus said in Mark 8:31, the Messiah must die. The Messiah must suffer. So the Messiah must die because it's God's plan A. It is already written into the Old Testament. And not only are these predictions a bracket to the transfiguration, the glory, there is this transfiguration story, and before that, Mark 8:31, and after that, Mark 9:9 and 9:12. So as I said, the 2 pieces of bread that are the brackets to the meat, they are so important that Jesus repeats it 4 times in the Gospel of Mark. So it's like what I do when I teach as a professor. I tell my students, if I repeat something, it is important. If I repeat 3 times, it will come out in the exam. This is 4 times. It definitely will be in the exam. So the other 2 passages in Mark are Mark 10:33-45 and Mark 14:21 and 41. So it was very important for the disciples to know this. God's glory on the mountain must be dimmed in the valley of death before it is manifested again on high. And this is our human experience. We go high on the mountain, the spiritual high, God speaks to us, but we must live in the valley. Living in the valley of the dim. Many of us are like Peter, too fast, too impulsive, too dim. We don't get it. We speak and act when we are ignorant of God's will. Maybe we think that if we speak more, God will listen to us. Or maybe we think that if we speak more, it will come true. In fact, we often prefer that God engineers things according to our plans. This is my plan. This is my vision of what will happen, God. So I want you to do this. It's as if we are the masters and God is our servant, and not the other way around. And you see, we don't want good things to ever end. Good things need to go on forever. We want it never to end. And we don't want bad news. And when we get bad news, you know, when a child gets bad news, that child wants to have the sugar candy, and mommy says, no, it's dinner time, you eat dinner first. And the child is petulant, and the child goes, no, 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 I want my candy. Yeah. Sometimes we act like that before God. No, 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 I want my candy, even if it's not good for me. We want to remain forever on the highs of our lives, on the mountaintop, because it feels so good. But we live in the valley and must return from the mountaintop. We must go back to our lives in a broken world and live it for the glory of God, to be the salt and light in the valley, where it is dimmed with pain and evil, disappointments and despair, disease and war. And we will have to be in the valley, longing and looking forward to the glory when Jesus returns again. And we say, when, Lord, when? We need you to come soon, very soon. Maranatha. God never promised there'll be no rain in our lives, the song says. He promises that he will turn our sorrows into joy. And he promises strength and power through the storms of our tears. He says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. When you're weak and vulnerable and in pain and suffering, and you're crying buckets, God says, my son, my daughter, my grace is with you. My grace is sufficient. When you're weak, that's when you will be more powerful, because you will turn to me and I will give you strength. Last week we heard in Mark 8:34, Jesus reminds us to carry our cross. And as I mentioned, the cross is not just any burden we have, any pain we have. It is to be ready for death, humiliation, and sacrifice, just like Jesus did. If you're a Christian, you say, Lord, I'm ready to carry my cross. That's what you promise God. I will die like you die, a sacrificial death if necessary. And so what is all these small little disappointments here in the valley of death? They don't mean a thing to me. They don't hurt me anymore. And so may we be encouraged this morning to be silent and strong when the storms and the floods of life come into the valleys where we live. And may we give all our disappointments and pain to Jesus, because indeed he will save and restore us in our valleys before he calls us home to his glory. And the glory will come. That's the promise of God.